Mungall made her name in the BC legislature by fighting for people who were in need. Single mums with kids, those on social assistance, disability benefits, and then all of a sudden Premier John Horgan comes along and say, I'm going to make you Minister of Energy and Mines. I think a lot of people were surprised, but Michelle has done a very good job, and I think she must be growing into it as well because it's a fascinating portfolio.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC, and to give her the full title, British Columbia's Minister of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources. So an enormous portfolio and a very complicated one. Welcome to the show, Minister.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here.
And happy International Women's Day.
Thank you.
And the cabinet of the first gender-balanced cabinet in British Columbia history. So interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. I wouldn't even know what it's like to work in a cabinet where we don't have gender balance, and having it is just fantastic, right? I think it's great role modeling for women all over, but it's also really important that our cabinet reflect our province as much as it possibly can. And we have 50% women in our population, so of course we should have 50% women in our cabinet.
Some tough portfolios, the finance minister, transportation, and yours, energy, mines, and petroleum resources. We had something nice happen in the BC legislature today, however, and that doesn't happen every day in the BC legislature, so I thought I should mention it. We had a change of rules in the House on International Women's Day, although it isn't just for women, that allows members of the legislature who are caring for infants to bring the infants into the chamber at times.
That's right. And so there wasn't a rule that explicitly prohibited or explicitly allowed a parent to bring their infant to the floor of the chamber, to the House, if they needed to. But faced with the numbers as they are in the House, and me being an expecting mother, and I immediately thought of, oh goodness, what if the bells ring? That a vote needs to happen. It takes me exactly 5 minutes to get from my office to the chamber. What if I have my baby and I can't pass him or her off to somebody else to look after, or I'm nursing or something? Yeah. I can't lose the opportunity to vote on behalf of my constituents. And so I talked about it with the government House leader and with the clerk's office and with the speaker. And they came together along with the opposition House leader and the third-party House leader and decided, let's make this formal. Let's make this explicitly stated in our standing orders, the rules that govern what we do, and say that, yes, infants can be on the House and that on the chamber floor, and so that we're supporting young families and making this a more family-friendly work environment.
And Spencer Chandler Herbert, who... 2-year-old, right? No, 1-year-old.
No, yeah, he just had his first birthday.
He and his partner have a 1-year-old, so he's said that he may have to take advantage of it too. I should explain the 5-minute rule. So when they're having a vote in the British Columbia legislature, and government can lose votes when it's this close, they ring the bells. You've got 5 minutes to get in the chamber. Then they lock the doors. So the minister's not kidding when she says she may need the full 5 minutes to get in there. We once had a premier who didn't make it into the chamber, and the government just about lost the tie vote. So it does happen. If you want to see the whole exchange in the House, and I say it was a nice warm moment today with all members. You could see it. It's right after question period this morning on the Parliament channel, so I think it starts at just after 11, goes on for about 15-20 minutes, and quite a nice thing. And as I said, not every day in the British Columbia legislature is that sweet, so you might want to see it. We got a lot of questions for you, Minister, a lot of questions on tape, and I think I'm going to jump right in on a couple of them and then catch up on a few other things. Let's go to liquefied natural gas. Here's Jordan Bateman.
Minister, I know Andrew Weaver doesn't believe in LNG, but I think the NDP government seems to. What I want to know is this. What is your ministry actively doing to get a $40 billion investment like LNG Canada across the line?
So we've had some of these projects that sort of fell off the table, right? There's still a few that are still active, I think.
Very, very much so, actually. Global market prices are going to be the #1 predictor for the type of investment that's needed for such large projects, and that's why, unfortunately, this summer we saw Petronas leave its plans for Pacific Northwest LNG. And but LNG Canada is still very much committed to working in British Columbia.
That's in Kitimat.
And that's in Kitimat, yes. And they are anticipating to have a final investment decision within this calendar year. And so they're still very much actively pursuing. There's other projects as well, such as Quispa, which is formerly Steelhead, Kitimat LNG, which is a partnership between Chevron and Woodside. And so there's other projects. In fact, the first shipment of LNG was by Fortis.
Oh,
and yes, yeah, this.
That's in the Lower Mainland, right?
That's correct, in the Lower Mainland, and that happened just a few months ago. And so, but in terms of where does the NDP stand in all of this? Well, it was interesting over the last, let's see now, 7 years. The Green Party accused us of always being supportive of LNG, and the Liberals always accused us of being against LNG. The fact is for the last 7 years, we've had the exact same policy, and we've never changed, is that we want to see LNG go forward, but there's 4 conditions it needs to meet, and that's there has to be good training and job opportunities for British Columbians. British Columbia needs to be able to see the benefit of its resources, meaningful, strong partnerships with First Nations, and the ability to still meet our climate action goals and to protect our earth, land, and water. And what we're finding when it comes to meaningful partnerships with First Nations, well, the test is, what do the First Nations say? And so when I met many of the First Nations, especially the 21 First Nations that are along the line for LNG Canada from well to tidewater, many of them, the first time they met with me, said, we want to make sure that you're going to see this through and that you're going to see LNG Canada happen, because it's so important for our community, not just the economic development opportunity, but many of them had community-wide votes after they did their own environmental assessment process, and those communities came out in strong support of LNG Canada. So these companies are working really, really hard in partnership with First Nations, in partnership with local non-Indigenous communities as well. And they're wanting to ensure that there's good jobs opportunity, good apprenticeship opportunities. And what are we doing to get that LNG Canada $40 billion investment here going forward? To answer Jordan's question, is as soon as I was given this portfolio and given the full backstory of what had been going on, and of course I was on the job 6 days when Petronas decided to pull out for global market pricing, and I instructed my ministry to move forward with looking at how do we be competitive in the current global market pricing, in the current climate. And so we've done that work, and we've identified ways in which we can increase our competitiveness. We've put that forward to LNG Canada, and they are bringing that forward to their primary decision makers, their investors, as part of their final investment decision process.
Talk about LNG. You get into controversy, you're right, with the Green Party. And here's a question from Christina Winter of the Green Party.
Minister Mungall, you've previously praised the LNG industry and natural gas industry as being very forward-thinking when it comes to reducing greenhouse gases. However, the greenhouse gas of most concern with natural gas extraction is methane, and when it comes to methane, these industries are anything but forward-thinking. 85% of active gas wells are currently spewing methane into our atmosphere daily, and 35% of inactive or abandoned wells continue to leak methane into the environment. This is despite the fact that the technology exists in low-emitting or zero-emitting pneumatic devices that would allow these industries to contain and minimize their emissions, even capturing the gas back for sale. Recent research has showed that methane emissions from BC's shale gas areas are 2.5 times higher than BC government estimates. Minister Mungall, how can you claim that these industries are forward-looking at reducing emissions when they neither record and report their emissions accurately, nor install the technologies that would allow them to reduce their overall emissions?
It's a complicated ministry. That's a long question.
It sure is. Well, there's a few things that I'm going to deconstruct there. So About the industry, one of the things that the industry is looking to do is to electrify as much as possible. So right now, a lot of the compression, a lot of the production of natural gas and the extraction, the energy that's allowing all of that to happen is natural gas itself. And so the industry is actually looking to get off fossil fuels and electrify using renewable electricity. So that's going to reduce the overall GHG emissions. Now, she's talking about methane leaks, and no one's denying that this is an issue. And in fact, I was going to just drop an acronym and I'll spell it out, sorry. The Oil and Gas Commission, the OGC, which is an independent regulator arm of government, is partnering with UBC and Geoscience BC to increase the well monitoring in terms of methane leaks into the groundwater system. So they're actually expanding their monitoring function to get the data, and so that we can find ways to reduce it and make sure that we're doing it in the best possible way. Another thing that we're doing as a new government, and we'll be making the announcement in just a couple of weeks, is our scientific panel on hydraulic fracturing.
I was going to ask you where that stood, so good.
Yeah. So we've just...
So you squirt a whole lot of water way down into the earth.
Yeah, about 3 to 4 kilometers down.
You shatter the rock down there and releases the gas in it, and that's how we develop our gas in British Columbia.
That's
been going on
correct.
for a long time.
Since 1950.
Okay. So the issue is it safe?
Exactly. So what are some of the problems that occur from this type of industrial activity? So concerns around contamination of groundwater, methane leaks, induced seismicity as well. And so
the occasional small earthquake.
That's right. And so our scientific panel is going to be looking at all of that to make sure that we have good, solid knowledge in the public sphere and that we're able to better regulate based on that knowledge, but also to work with industry to incentivize them to do things better. There's always room for improvement. I think everybody acknowledges that. And when I sit down with industry and talk to them about what our plans are, they agree. There's always learning opportunities for them to do better.
You got asked in the House last fall about somebody suggested a moratorium while this review takes place, and your answer was, get real. The gas that comes to my house, the gas that comes to your house is fracked right now.
That's right. Yep.
And so we couldn't shut it all down while we review, but there is going to be a review.
That's right. I can't imagine anybody here anybody in BC who relies on natural gas to heat their home and heat their water suddenly saying, yeah, sure, put a moratorium on it. I don't want to have a warm home and I don't want to have a nice hot shower in the morning. I have not met the person who says that.
Well, we have a question from Judy Tayabji. What the hell? Let's just run it. Here she is.
I have a question for this minister. Having chased out the largest potential single investment in Canadian history when Pacific Northwest left last year because of the change in government, I mean, I know they cited market conditions because they're really polite, but we all know that when we have a premier and a minister of environment writing letters saying we oppose this, they're going to go somewhere else. And since then, we've seen record investments in Alaska and Washington State. So obviously, the market conditions are ripe. Well, now we have a chance with LNG Canada to see a really significant investment in Kitimat. Thousands of jobs, billions of dollars in revenue to the Crown, for the people of BC. So I want to know, what is this minister doing to make sure that that investment actually lands in BC? Because it matters.
So one thing I will ask you about, she's mentioned the Petronas thing. 3 members of the current legislature did join the occupation of the island where Petronas was going to try to locate.
Lilu Island.
Lilu Island. And I see last week that the First Nations leader who was leading that occupation lost his court case. A significant portion of that First Nation supported the development. He opposed it, and he failed to make the case in court that he had a legitimate claim. So is there any regrets around that your party got involved in essentially a claim that didn't stand up?
Well, first I just want to hand it to Judy for being always on point with her partisanship.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah.
So around Lilu Island, so the Lax Kw'alaams and many of the First Nations and many of the local communities in the Prince Rupert area did not support the location of Pacific Pacific Northwest LNG.
Yep.
And I'm so used to saying the acronyms.
That's okay.
And so they didn't, it wasn't that they didn't support the project, they didn't support the location of the project, which was Lilu Island. It had long-standing spiritual significance and closeness with the salmon runs, is my understanding. And so what we said is that we support those local communities and what a lot of people don't actually know is that, because the news was that Petronas was closing its interests for a liquefied natural gas facility in BC. But what they had actually done, in my understanding, is they actually had resited where they would be putting their trains, and that would have been on Ridley Island, which is an industrial island. There's a lot of industrial activities going on there. AltaGas just is starting to put its liquefied...
That's where the airport is in Rupert, too.
Yeah, propane and so on. So there's... So that was a better location, and it actually was going to end up saving the money in the end, but the numbers weren't working out for them when it came to what's going on with the global market pricing. They were really clear on that, and again, this happened 6 days into our government. So my question back to Judy is, where were her friends in terms of ensuring that BC was competitive in a changing environment? They weren't anywhere. We, on the other hand, took action.
I'm seeing, though, reports out of China and from some of the big energy producers and some of the big think tanks saying that, you know, liquefied natural gas demand is going to recover and there will be increased demand. China's buying a lot of it. Do you think we'll see it here one of these days?
I do. So what happened is that as LNG started to really come online around the world, is you had a bit of a gold rush, right? Prices shot up. You had those gold rush prices. Everybody went for it in terms of wanting to develop LNG plants. That brings the price down, and you end up having a glut on the market. And then things come back up and they start to stabilize. So things are going to start to come back up, and the anticipation is by about 2020. And from there on, we'll see a bit more of a stabilized pricing. You'll see your ups and downs, but that big initial gold rush price, we probably won't see again.
Takes about, as I recall, about 4 years to build one if they decide to go ahead. So if the decision was yes later this year, then what are we at? It'll be 2022, 2023 before up and running and shipping and stuff.
That's right. They'll likely hit that sweet spot.
And there's still a federal issue with this too, right?
That's right.
We're trying to get the federal government to allow importing terminals are built in pieces overseas and assembled here. And you need to persuade the tariff people to let them come in without putting a big tariff on them, right?
So what we have right now in Canada at the federal level is some anti-dumping tariffs, right? So other jurisdictions in the world who manufacture steel products at a cheaper rate than what we do here in Canada can't just dump their products in Canada. The difference here is that the type of fabricated steel that's required for what's called these LNG trains are not constructed anywhere in North America at all, not constructed in Canada. They are constructed overseas, and so to be able to even construct these trains, we would require to bring, LNG Canada, for example, would be required to bring those components over. Now, should they be penalized? Because there's no dumping going on, and it's not that could have been manufactured in Canada. So they're working with the federal government on this.
We'll be back with the minister, and I bet you're wondering when I'm going to ask her about Site C, and I will. Stay with us on Voice of BC. We'll be right back.
Recent reports have raised the possibility that the Site C megadam would be used to power mines in the Yukon. That is, of course, if it's not used to power fracking or the export of liquefied fracked gas or the Alberta tar sands. It's misleading to claim that Site C is clean power when it seems destined to provide power to projects that are environmental disasters.
My name is Irene Lansinger, and I'm the president of the BC Federation of Labour, and I love politics. My work is politics, my play is politics, I'm about politics all the time, and that's what Voice of BC is about. So come back to hear some more politics.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV.
Minister Mungall has already proved that she's willing to shed a bit of her activist past when it comes to issues like the Site C Dam, a project that she campaigned against, but is going forward because it's the right thing to do. Hopefully she does the same with LNG and with the Kinder Morgan pipeline. We need these projects. We need this private investment in British Columbia. We need to keep British Columbians working.
Come on, Jordan, as the song says, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Let's stay with the minister. Lots of questions for her. Go back to BC Business Council. Jock Finlayson, here he is.
Minister, I don't know if you saw the news reports based on a speech given by Steve Williams, the President and Chief Executive of Suncor, the largest Canadian-based energy company. He said in early February that Suncor was no longer looking at investing in new or greenfield projects in Canada. Canada's become too costly, too uncertain, and too complex to undertake major new energy investments. The only capital that the company will be deploying in Canada going forward is sustaining capital to help fund their existing operations. Are you and your government worried about the seeming decline of confidence in the energy industry to invest in Canada and the outflows of capital that appear to be accelerating?
Minister.
I don't know if I agree with Jock's analysis based on one CEO's particular decision. What we're seeing in BC, for example, in the mining industry is that we're seeing increased investment. Commodity prices are coming back up, but not only that is that there's going to be, the prediction is in the future is there's going to be quite a lot of demand for minerals that are found in British Columbia because our world is changing, whether it's iPhones or electric cars or wind turbines or solar panels. All the raw materials that go into these products are items that are found here in BC mines. And so what the prediction is that mining is going to be a great industry, and that's exactly why we're seeing some serious investment just in the last 6 months alone.
And a follow-up question on mining, something that happened under the last government that's still a loose end hanging out there. Bruce Halser, here he is.
You were the critic in opposition when the Mount Polley report came down, and you had a lot to say about that. Now that you're the minister responsible, are you looking to reopen that decision, or are you generally satisfied to leave it behind us? And do you think that there needs to be any new rules or new legislation with respect to mine safety, and especially with respect to tailing ponds and dams?
So first, if you'll recall from the top of the hour, and of course, Vaughn, you were there. I was not the critic when that Mount Polley disaster took place. I was the critic for social development. Nevertheless, in terms of moving forward with mine safety, well, that'll be one of the very items that is in the terms of reference for the Mining Jobs Task Force that I announced last week. And so we have a group of 12 people coming together to identify how we can ensure that we have good family supporting jobs in the mining industry going forward that can sustain the commodity pricing fluctuation, but also how do we make sure that our job sites are healthy and safe places for people to work, because everybody has the right to go to work in the morning or at the beginning of a shift and be able to go home at the end of the day without injury. And so we need to be considering the importance of mine site safety for workers, but also for the communities at large. And one of the things that came out from the Mount Polley disaster, as well as from the Auditor General, is that we need to have an independent compliance and enforcement unit. And so we're working on that in my ministry. And it looks different in different jurisdictions on how you'd actually do that. But what most jurisdictions have found as a best practice is that it stays within the ministry or a state department. But the people who do the permitting are not the same people who do the compliance and enforcement. That means you have more boots on the ground, you have more eyes looking at these sites and making sure that they're safe, not only for the workers, but for the community as a whole.
So that you're going to probably separate those?
That's right. That's what we're working on right now.
Well, you put out a press release last fall. Well, first of all, it was in the NDP election platform that you were going to freeze BC Hydro rates for a year, and then there was a press release announcing that you'd kept the promise to freeze them, and then, I guess, what was it, just last week we discovered they're not being frozen because the BC Utilities Commission turned down the freeze. So, was it a mistake to promise it when you weren't sure you could deliver? Was it a mistake to say you'd done it when you hadn't? And you didn't overrule the Utilities Commission. How come?
So in that very press release, and I spent days, you'll remember, in budget estimates answering questions from both the Greens and the Liberals, and was very clear that we were always going to go to the BC Utilities Commission. And I guess we kind of took it for granted that people would appreciate that that's exactly what we had to do, because that is the appropriate process. But of course, after 16 years where you had a Liberal government that would more often than not direct the BC Utilities Commission to actually increase hydro rates, people might have forgotten that that was the appropriate process, and that was always the process that we would go through, because this government wants to respect that independence of that regulator. And I'm glad that we did, because we learned a lot about BCUC's review, not just of our request for a rate freeze, but of the broader rates plan. We learned that we have a bit of a financial mess at BC Hydro. It's a mess that this government is going to have to clean up, and we will do that. There's concerns that have been long raised by Auditor Generals about the deferral accounts, which are now at about $6 billion. The $50 billion in liabilities to various independent power producers. That was something that we raised as an alarm back in 2008 and 2009. And we're very clear that it was not right for ratepayers to have to pay inflated costs for these private power projects. The Liberals went ahead with that, and now that issue has come home to roost, and the BCUC highlighted it. And those are the reasons why, among a few others, that BCUC said, no, we can't do a rate freeze at this time, because BC Hydro just does not have the financial capacity to do that. So hugely disappointing when I talk to people around BC who are, like I said, as the social development critic, people I know who are living in poverty, every dollar counts for them. So while the average person would have only saved $23 on their bill, for some people that really meant a lot. And so we want to make sure that we're still helping the people who really need it the most out. And that's why in May we'll have available a crisis grant that people can apply for from BC Hydro to help them with their bill when they see a crisis and it's impacting their ability to pay. And a more long-term solution, which is allowing for lifeline rates. And we're going to be working on the legislation this spring and bringing it forward this spring to do that.
You sort of imagine the situation over at the BC Utilities Commission, because the minister's right, the Liberals overruled it. They removed whole projects from the power review. The commission's sitting there going, well, we'll make a decision on this one. I wonder if they'll let us make it. They did. They let them make it. We'll let Thielman ask the question, because it does raise a really interesting question about future of energy regulation in British Columbia. Here's Bill.
Minister, the BC Utilities Commission had a tough job to look at the Site C dam issues in a real hurry, unusual for them. But what is the future of the BC Utilities Commission? In the past, governments of all stripes have tended to avoid it from time to time on controversial issues. What do you see as its future?
Strengthen it?
It has an incredibly important role, absolutely. I think that having an independent regulator takes the politics out of playing around with BC Hydro and playing around with rates, playing around with projects and so on. It provides a very sobering view. I mean, that's exactly what they did with Site C when we learned that the actual cost was going to be higher than what the Liberals said it would be. And so they have a very important role, and how do we ensure that it stays as a strong independent regulator going forward? My understanding is that the Auditor General wants to take a look at that very issue. There was a core review of BCUC done as well in 2014, 2015. And yes, I can get you a copy of the report. And a lot of the things that core review suggested, BCUC has been implementing ever since. And their last report, that's going to be made public soon, highlights some of the major administrative things that, you know, they're not very sexy, they're not very exciting to the average person, but the average person is benefiting from them in terms of their capacity and their ability to deliver as an independent regulator.
The minister mentioned the question of the deferral accounts, and they started piling up in the last decade. It was the Auditor General, actually, that first blew the whistle on them, and while it may not seem all that sexy, discovering that Hydro has taken about $6 billion of current spending and pushed it down the road, deferred it to be repaid at some future date. It's nice stuff if you can do it with your family finances, but I wouldn't particularly recommend it. In any event, that's some of the things you can get from an independent regulator, and I think the idea of strengthening BCUC and affirming its independence is probably a good thing. Jamie Lawson out at UVic with a question about clean energy. Here he is.
I noticed that with George Heyman, you've recently announced about $600,000 for clean energy initiatives in communities. And there's another program of about $2.5 million for clean energy vehicle purchases. Now, all that's kind of neat, and I really enjoyed looking at the solar-powered Zamboni fact. But I wonder, given the extent of the climate crisis we're facing, according to the major scientists of the world, isn't this really small change given the transition that we've got to do to meet BC's climate goals?
A fair guess that a lot more to come?
Oh yes, we're just getting started. I will say though, in the budget update in September, there was $40 million there for a zero emission vehicle program, and that's spread out over 3 years to incentivize people to buy zero emission vehicles, but also to work with communities in charging stations. Now, I live in rural BC. I have one of the highest passes, road passes in the country. My concern is not only range anxiety, but weather anxiety as well. And so the incentive to buy electric vehicles is really great for Lower Mainland. But what do we do for rural areas? And so that's part of the overall thing that we need to start looking at as we want to roll out more, pardon the pun, roll out more electric vehicles around the province and really start transitioning our transportation fleets. And so there's a lot of things we need to be looking at. I know that Minister Heyman is doing his part with the Climate Council. We're going to be putting forward an energy roadmap from my ministry in terms of how do we look at transportation switching fuels and so on. How do we increase our renewables to meet that future demand and so on? A lot of rural communities that are in remote areas are on diesel. They're not even connected to the grid. How do we work with them so that they can build their own renewable energy and renewable capacity as well? So for those out there who are very interested in the whole energy file, they'll know what I meant by capacity, because you produce, but then you have to have something that's like a battery for later. So these are all the things that we're going to be looking at. And so anybody interested, stay tuned, because this is one of the reasons that I really wanted to be the Minister of Energy and Mines, and because there's so many exciting things. We're at a transition phase, I think, in our society, and the things that we get to do going forward, looking into the future, is really exciting.
I got an update this week on the electrical vehicle charging station at the BC Legislature, which is just outside the building where we're taping this show. And of course, Andrew Weaver is always hogging it and plugged in, and then Adam Olson comes along and Michael Lee. So anyway, I gather they're adding charging stations because there's already so much demand from members of the legislature to charge.
The demand is only going up all around the province.
Yeah. So we get more. We have time? Yes, we do. Ken Wu, here he is.
So now that the BC NDP have committed to spending at least another $7 billion to complete the Site C dam, which still might not be completed as a result of lawsuits by First Nations and protests and blockades, I'm wondering, is there any money left over to support the classic clean energy initiatives like wind power, like tidal power, like geothermal, and like solar power?
Well, the short answer to his question, and the Liberals, as you would know from question period the last week, would love this, yes. Okay. If we're looking for a yes or no answer. But absolutely there is. And I mean, his numbers are a bit wrong in terms of Site C. The original plan was closer to $9 billion, and we've now identified it as actually being more $10.7 billion. Billion's still a lot of money, so I don't want to dismiss that, but I just want to make sure the numbers are correct. So in terms of where we are seeing our future energy projections, what are people going to need? Well, if we want to achieve our goals to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore we're going to have to look at the energy that we're using. And so that means the opportunity for producing renewable energy is a lot bigger than we might actually think. And so not only, what some of the projections are suggesting is not only are we going to need a Site C, that amount of energy and capacity that comes with it, we're going to need at least two, and then maybe even more. And so looking into the future, even conservatively, there is opportunity not just for the large dam, but also for smaller projects. Now, I mentioned those communities that are off-grid, but First Nations have a real interest in starting to build their own energy assets, similar to like what the City of Nelson has, for example, which is what I'm most familiar with in terms of a small scale energy asset. We have our own power supply, we have our own transmission, we have our own distribution, billing, everything. So a lot of First Nations communities want to have something similar. They want to have that asset for future generations' benefit. And I think that's fantastic. And so we committed as part of going forward with Site C is that we're going to be working with First Nations on a program that would do exactly that.
And there's been the Utilities Commission report on Site C also mentioned some other options. There's a couple of geothermal projects in BC, one of them associated with a First Nation. That's, you know, we haven't really tried geothermal here, so that's one that there might be a possibility. Geothermal,
it's a bit tough in BC. Yeah. A lot of people would guess that it's not. We have extended the permitting process for exploration with Borealis near Valemont. Yes. And we're looking to have an energy purchase agreement with them as well, should they prove successful. It needs to be a certain temperature and a certain pressure and all these things for it to work in terms of generating electricity. Now, geothermal, in terms of heating homes, lots of opportunity there. But when it comes to generating electricity, it's not been that successful for us in BC. But that doesn't mean people aren't still exploring it.
Yeah. Take a brief break with the Minister on Voice of BC. One more section, and God, let's see, at least two more questions on Site C. How exciting. Stay with us.
People talk the talk, and what people want is the action. Indigenous people are fed up with people saying they're going to do one thing and then doing something else. You know, you can talk about enshrining UNDRIP in legislation and then not follow it. You can talk about enshrining climate targets in legislation and then not do anything. To me, what's critical is that you take steps and actions to deliver in this area.
You've landed on the right channel. I'm George Heyman, MLA for Vancouver Fairview, and you're watching Voice of BC, where you're going to hear great questions and the answers that you need to hear about the issues affecting you.
There's an old saying that the worst day in government is better than the best day in opposition. But I suspect Energy and Mines Minister Michelle Mungall, on the day that the Site C decision had to be made, was thinking back to the days in opposition, where it was a lot easier to criticize than to take the heat for a decision that is a tough one.
Welcome back to Voice of BC. Site C, yes. There were a lot of people who had a lot of questions for the show. And I still get emails every day from people who think that Site C is going to be canceled or stopped or not happen or be a disaster. It was a tough decision. I tried to get it down to 2 or 3 outstanding issues. Here's one of them. And we're going to Caitlin Vernon, Sierra Club. Here she is.
This government has promised to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yet the approval of the Site C megadam flies in the face of this commitment. To approve a dam that is opposed by the nations who live there and is intended to provide subsidized power to multinational fracking and LNG corporations is completely disrespectful of Indigenous rights. How are you going to ensure that the UN Declaration is more than just hollow words?
Well,
I would like to start by saying that First Nations are not a homogenous group. They are diverse. They have diverse opinions within their own communities, and they are diverse amongst themselves. Just like Europe has multiple cultures and multiple nations, well, before my ancestors came here in 1636 and before anybody sailed across the Atlantic, First Nations had multiple nations with their distinct cultures, their distinct languages, their distinct spiritualities. To lump all of them as the same is just not right. And for Site C, a lot of people have done that, when in fact that's not the case at all. I actually sat down with all 7 of the Treaty 8 First Nations on the BC side of the border. And yes, there are 2 nations who are very, very adamantly opposed, and their communities are by and large unified on this. There's one First Nation that was very much pro-Site C. And then the other nations, I would say, had some mix in their communities, and in the end decided to sign impact benefit agreements with Site C. And their presentations to us were that they weren't going to tell us which direction to go. They were just going to tell us what kind of outcome they wanted for their nation. Should we go forward with it or should we not go forward with it? And it was a very powerful day sitting down with all the nations that both Minister Fraser and I did. And we did it in the spirit of UNDRIP. We did it in the spirit of reconciliation, where we were working with them and hearing them and having a better understanding of their perspective, rather than just being briefed by staff, as can often be the case in government. And so going forward, there are still both the West Moberly and Prophet River remain opposed to Site C, and that is their right. They are entitled to have an opinion.
They're in court this summer, I believe.
That's right.
Against BC Hydro.
That's right, and that's their right. Nevertheless, we're going to continue to work with them and other nations on a very important issue for all of them, which was the realignment of Highway 29. The original proposal went through some sacred sites, and they were very concerned, and they wanted that original proposal changed, and that's exactly what we're doing.
The highway has to be moved because eventually the existing routing will be underwater when the water starts rising behind the dam.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but that the rerouting is being rerouted, is what you're telling me.
That's right. Yeah, and because we want to accommodate and make sure that First Nations sacred sites and traditional burial sites are respected, and so that's what we're doing.
Christina Winter again, the Green Party, and another Site C question, and the last actually. Here she is.
Minister Mungall, your government has approved the Site C Dam project in spite of the current massive cost overruns, warnings from the BC Utilities Commission that the project is unlikely to be completed on time or on budget, and evidence from other jurisdictions of the perils that projects such as Site C and Muskrat Falls can have for the public purse. Minister Mungall, do you think that the costs for Site C will rise above $10.7 billion?
It's a good question. And we're doing everything we can to make sure that it doesn't. We want to keep this project on budget. we identified, well, the BCUC identified that it was likely not going to stick to the Liberals' original budget. And it's really interesting how the Liberals came to that original number, because my understanding is they chose a number that in the modeling process had a 50% chance of having cost overruns.
Right.
I don't think that's very conservative. I don't think that's very fiscally prudent. We chose a total that had a 90% chance of being met, so that it would not have any of those cost overruns. And so we chose that number, which is $10.7 billion. And I don't think we would have really understood and appreciated how that calculation under the Liberals was not appropriate if it wasn't for the BCUC, which goes to show exactly why you should always go to the BCUC with these types of projects. What we're going to do, though, to make sure that we stay at that 10.7 is that we've put in a new project assurance board. So there was a Site C project board under the previous government. It met quite infrequently, and it didn't have, I would say, some of the necessary expertise. So we want people who know what it is to build a large project, who have had experience in terms of turnarounds when something was not going as it should, and then turning it around and getting it back on time and on budget. And we are going to be announcing our project assurance board very shortly. I have to make some phone calls to a few more of the people we've identified with the skills necessary. They're going to be meeting on a monthly basis, so frequently. And not only are they going to be reporting back to the board of BC Hydro, they're going to be reporting back to Treasury Board. So for those who don't know what Treasury Board is, that's a board of ministers and MLAs who have the responsibility, as well as a whole staff, to dot all those I's, cross all those T's, and count all those pennies.
Toughest-minded financial analysts in the government are behind Treasury Board, and that's the staff. They're the ones who say no to spending requests all the time. Ministers find it sobering sometimes to go in front of Treasury Board. I wanted to ask you, what I get the construction updates every 2 weeks from the Site C project and tell you what they're working on there, and then, of course, they're working away, and they have been all the way through. What are the next big things happening on the project? There's a huge contract for building the generating station and spillways. That's coming fairly soon now?
Fairly soon, yes. BC Hydro is just completing its due diligence on the bids that were put forward. And so they're completing that full due diligence process, and they'll be making their announcement soon enough.
And then there's a couple of transmission lines, and there's contracts to relocate the highway to come too, right?
That's right. And before we finalize those contracts to relocate the highway, we need to complete our work with First Nations communities, as well as the Boone family, for example, and other landowners in the area.
The main civil works are still under construction. There is a diversion of the river, which, because of runoff conditions, can only really happen in September of a given year. And is that still 2019, or has that now been pushed off to 2020?
My understanding is still 2019. I don't think I've seen any changes.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that.
You're normally very on top of these things as well. So
the old guy's memories fade. You know. It's kind of sad, really. You know. Let's go to Bill Tillman. Good question. Beyond Site C. Here's Bill.
Minister, BC is increasing its carbon tax, and the federal government is also ensuring that all Canadian provinces have a carbon tax soon. Are you concerned, however, with what impact it has on industries that are competing internationally with countries that have no carbon tax and that can undercut Canadian producers for things like coal and other minerals?
And what are you going to do with all the money?
Right.
So it goes up on the 1st of April.
Yep.
And it'll go up on the 1st of April every year by $5, which is about, what, 2 cents a liter on gasoline, I think? Something like that, yeah.
Your math is done better than mine, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, we don't have Andrew Weaver here. He has a degree in advanced mathematics, and he can sort these things out. Anyway, let's go.
So the answer to that is yes. We want to ensure that we remain competitive in BC, but we also want to make sure that we're reducing our carbon emissions and that we have the right incentives as well as the right disincentives for industry way for individuals in terms of reducing our overall carbon emissions. And so the carbon tax is not going away here in BC, but what can we do to make sure that it's not a deterrent for investment in British Columbia? Those are some of the things that the Climate Action Council with Minister Heyman that they're looking into as well.
And the money under the Liberals, they used to offset it with tax breaks and things that they said were tax breaks. Your government is keeping the money. Have you figured out how you're going to spend it yet?
Yeah, so we've always felt, and you know what, a lot of people I've talked to around BC feel the exact same way, is that revenue neutral, well, what's the point? What's the point of having a carbon tax to act as a disincentive for carbon emissions if we're not doing anything to actually support individuals and industry in reducing carbon emissions? So that's what the tax is for. It's going to be levying a tax to raise funds so that we can turn around and find ways to give people alternatives to their carbon emissions. So whether that's transit, whether that's electrifying industry, or say there's a mine in a remote area that is doing all of their work and producing all of their energy using diesel, how can perhaps we partner with them to get them off the diesel and on to a renewable source?
And as I recall, there's also more low-income incentives coming, right? Or
That's
relief
right.
for people for whom it is a burden, and there may be more coming along that line.
That's right, but I'm not going to steal the thunder from Minister James or Minister
Well, she's
Heyman.
already flagged some of that. Yeah, she was on the show too, you know. Okay, let's go to a nice political question. Bruce Halser, here he is.
Minister, I get very concerned when I hear your coalition partner, Andrew Weaver, talk about how the BC government should essentially process the Trans Mountain Pipeline to death. Basically drag out permitting until it's just not financially viable for Trans Mountain to go forward. That to me flies in the face of the rule of law in this province and good process, fair process for people who want to invest here. What's your view on using permits as a way to slow this thing down?
And Bruce Halser is mere moments away as soon as we get an answer from the minister on that one.
Well, we haven't been using the permitting process to slow the Trans Mountain Pipeline down because of the rule of law, and we are following the law, and we are using the law as well. And so the public will know the things that we've done, which is intervenor status in the appeal process, as well as seeking a reference in terms of our jurisdiction in governing environmental, governing the coastline, and so on. And so this is all playing out in the media right now. But in terms of the permitting process, we have not been delaying or anything. What we have been doing is asking Kinder Morgan to do its job, dot its I's, cross its T's, sharpen its pencils, do the permitting process properly, and making sure that it follows the same rules as everybody else.
Suggestion today, if you're watching us on Thursday, live in the throne speech in the province of Alberta from Premier Notley, that Alberta is looking at other options. They've given up on the wine boycott and they've taken that off the table, but at other options to deal with British Columbia if there's obstruction of the pipeline construction out here. And she says one of the things may be that they would reduce the flow of oil to British Columbia. And I've seen some suggestion today in very short-term media response that, well, that might drive up the price of gasoline at the pump to by another $1 or something. What do you think?
Well, I found it a very interesting suggestion coming from the Alberta government. And for the record, their job is to advocate for their residents, and our job is to advocate for our residents, and our residents don't agree on this pipeline. And frankly, my view is that we need to defend our coast. We need to defend the economic jobs, the economic activity that is happening on our coast as it is, and we don't need to be putting that at risk. But in terms of shutting off oil and gas to BC, well, it doesn't quite work that way anymore, where government can just make that decision. Most of that is controlled in private hands in terms of who owns the pipelines and who puts things through the pipelines and what they pay and so on and so forth. So I'm not too sure exactly what she's saying there and what ultimately she might mean by that, but I don't see it being a strong possibility.
Well, I guess what she's saying is you're saying out there in BC you don't want our oil, so we're saying you can't have our oil. Is that not what she's saying?
Well, that could be what she's saying. You'd have to ask her.
I said that Bruce Halser would be asking a political question, and here he is.
In the last election, your popular vote dropped about 9% in your riding. That's down more than 16% since Corky Evans used to hold it. A longtime NDP riding next door to you went BC Liberal, and you're one of now only 4 NDP MLAs in the entire BC interior. What do you think the NDP has to do to reverse this trend and start winning back votes in the interior of our province?
Well, I could probably correct him on some of his numbers there first. So Corky in 2005 won with a very strong majority, around 58%. But that was not his percentages in the 1990s. In fact, he was more in the 46 percentile. 2001, he lost the election. So the reason why I'm sharing those numbers is that they fluctuate from election to election to election. And unfortunately, nobody is doing polling to exactly find out why people might be switching their vote or why new people are voting and why they're voting a particular way. And so my best guess in this last election is it often depends on candidates in a rural area to see about a 2, 3, even a 5% change in vote and what kind of campaigns they're running. So, for example, both the Liberals and the Greens ran a much stronger campaign. They had really strong female candidates. I think both of them sorry, not both of them for the first time, but they had very strong female candidates as well, very strong women, well known throughout the region. So that's going to make a change because people are going to start to look up and pay more attention to what the other parties are having to say. So I don't know if he's thinking that there's some broader trend or something like that, but I would say that you need more political analysis to really determine what might be going on. But in my experience, in the last election, we had 2 very strong new candidates come forward, and I think that's only good for democracy.
Well, the other thing I would notice, because I covered the campaign, was that John Horgan chose to focus a great deal of his campaigning effort in the region where he calculated he had the best chance to win, to add seats to the NDP column, and he knocked off 10 Liberal seats in and around Metro Vancouver. And he spent an awful lot of his time campaigning there, and it worked. And I mean, victory tends to provide its own justification. He didn't spend as much time campaigning in the north and the interior as some NDP leaders have in the past. But the next campaign, the dynamic could be totally different.
That's right. I mean, each campaign, I would say, is reflective of the particular space and time that it exists in. And so this last election, there were increased ridings in the Lower Mainland. The population there is growing. And I would say the views of people were shifting there as well, right? Especially with the affordability crisis being the epicenter of the Lower Mainland. And so our leaders spent more time there, but the attention, I'd say province-wide, in terms of news and everything in the media, was focused there a lot more. I mean, maybe I'm just being a rural, and we always complain about how the Lower Mainland gets all the attention, but it certainly seemed to be the case this election.
And media resources are all concentrated there and all that. Are you facing recall up there? Are they already talking about recalling you in your ride?
I know Andrew Weaver made mention of that. Okay. My constituents, on the other hand, I got a lot of letters of support and some choice words for Andrew and his suggestion.
Thank you very much to Minister Mungall for being on the show. Really appreciate it. Very good.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into your living room. Good night. Straight at work.
The following is a community access program. While this program does not necessarily reflect the views of Shaw or its employees, Shaw is proud to support local producers and share local voices, ideas,